Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior English A, and we are now ready to introduce one of the classic texts of English literature, the epic poem Beowulf. Beowulf. Now, to get ready to talk about this poem, we have to go back to a concept that we were working with before, the timeline. Do you remember this concept? So let's put this in our notes real quickly. I love to begin with this kind of work where we draw a line down our page or across our page. We're going to put a 0 in the center of the page, and that 0 is going to represent for us the birth of Christ. Very good. The birth of Christ. And then we're going to divide that timeline up into 100-year segments that we call what? Centuries. Very good. Centuries, right? We talk about events which occur before the Common Era, BCE, and events which occur after the 0 that we'll call Common Era. Sometimes we will refer to this as AD, right? So, for example, we sit way out here. Wow, we just hit this year, didn't we, of 2014, right? 2014. And we're working then with what century? Well, the way we write it is the 21 with a big C around it. So it's the 21st century. That's the way we write this, all right? So here we are, 2014, the 21st century, right? And as we have said before, this is a very useful model for us. We just finished with Senior English B, where, for example, we marked 1800, remember, as the beginning of the age of the Romantics, right? Okay? So this is a very useful little model for us. We go back in time, remember these numbers, just like in math class, count down towards 0. We'll write 399 BCE as an important date. That's the year that Socrates, the great philosopher Socrates, was poisoned. We'll write roughly 200 BCE as the rise of Rome, one of the great empires, right? Okay, when we take the Greek epoch and the Roman epoch together, we call that the Greco-Roman period, right? Greek-Roman period. 410 will be for us the date that Rome falls, okay? We'll just use that as a working date, which means basically we're talking about Rome being in existence for roughly how many years? Well, if they rise at 200 and they fall at 410 Common Era, right, we're talking about roughly 600 years of history for Rome, right? And this project is a good, useful project for us. It allows us, for example, to be able to place different dates on the timeline, right? We're familiar with that little phrase, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in what was it? Do you remember? Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492, right? 1492. Uh-oh. 1492 is what century? Don't say it, write it. 1492 is what century? Well, if it's 2014 this year, 20, but we go up a number, 21, right? If it's 1492, it's what century then? It is, isn't it? It's the 15th century, right? 8 years before the, what century? 8 years before the 16th century, right? Because it would move to 1492 moves to 1500. Well, now, Mr. McGee, I don't understand. If it's 1500, then how come it isn't the 15th century? That frustrates me, because that would make it easy. You know what I mean? Why don't we just call it, if it's 1500, the 15th century? Why, if it's 1500, we don't call it, why do we have to call it the 16th century? The answer is actually very simple. We go back to the 0, and we start counting up. 50 years after the birth of Christ, 90 years after the birth of Christ, 98, 99, 100, and we call that first 100 years the first century, don't we? Then 150, 180, 190, 199, 200, and we call this the second century, even though the numbers are 100. Does that make sense? And so when we hit 1492, we're actually talking about the 15th century. And this project is really useful for us as academics, because then we can put important information on the timeline. Now, we're working with Senior English A. And if you looked in your table of contents, you don't have to, but if you looked in your table of contents in your book, you would see that we're working with 3 units in our book. Unit number 1 will constitute what we will call the period of the Anglo-Saxons. And you're going to write a date now on your timeline of 1000. You're going to circle that date. 1000. So you want to put that one, Ricardo, in your notes. All right, let's go now. You need to be working on some notes with me. Let's get out paper and pen. I need your focus. Because if you've got this intel in your brain, then I can help you to learn this information so much easier. 1,000 years after the birth of Christ, okay, BC, E is before birth, CE, common era, after the birth. 1,000, we're going to label this as Beowulf and the Anglo-Saxons. Okay, the Anglo-Saxon period. Now, for your notes, you'll want to say this. 1,000 common era is the year that we will kind of begin to think about England as its own place. England. Now, in your junior year, in that anthology, we studied American authors. In your senior year, we study British authors. Why do we give time to British authors? Like, you know my question? Why don't we study French authors or Russian authors? Or right? Why British? Why is the British so important? Anybody know? Why do we care about the British so much in our senior year? Well, that's right. The early American thinkers were from what place? And the American Revolutionary War was fought against what country? England, right? So the very early American thinkers were British. And so we look at British literature now in our senior year. And we begin now with 1000 common era. Let's put a couple of more dates on here. You can write 1300 as being the date that we will call Chaucer, and we'll come to him later. Right? If you've already started filling out your master schedule, you probably saw something about Chaucer, okay? And then finally, let's write 1600 and circle that one. That's the age of Shakespeare and the Renaissance. And then at 1700, we're going to call that the age of science, or the scientific enlightenment, or the age of reason. And then, of course, after 1700, we get to 1800, which is, again, where we started last September, remember, when we began with our work of the Romantics, right? So what of all of that, Mr. McGee, do I really need to have written down? Because you put a lot of stuff on the whiteboard. The most important thing is the year 1000. Got me? The year 1000. And when we are looking at the year 1000, we are talking about the great Anglo-Saxon text called Beowulf. All right? Beowulf. Now, let's talk for a few moments about what this text is all about. It's the first one in our hymnal that we'll pay some close attention to, this text, Beowulf. Okay? First of all, for your notes, you want to make sure you get the spelling correctly. So look at your Beowulf packet, or turn to page, 41 of your hymnals, 41 of your hymnals, and make sure that you get the spelling correct. Okay? Beowulf. Now, when we're looking at this text, we will call it an epic poem. Okay? So you want to get that in your notes. Epic poem. And what do we mean when we use that term? Well, let's give it a few characteristics, shall we? 1, it's going to be a long poem. So it's not going to be a short poem, it's going to be a long poem if it's an epic poem. 2, it's going to tell the story of a famous epic hero, in this case, Beowulf. Okay, so it's going to tell a story where this epic hero will go on a journey, where during the epic hero's life he has to fight battles, okay, major conquests, major fighting involved. In fact, we will talk about the 3 parts of Beowulf as the 3 monsters that Beowulf will fight against. Make sense? Okay. The epic poem is a national song. Now, what do I mean by that? Simple. If you want to know about a people, you look at their most famous epic poem. And it will tell you something about what matters to that culture. The culture that produces the poem Beowulf is a culture that we will call not early England, but rather Anglo-Saxon. So you want to write that down. Anglo-Saxon. It's a phrase that's going to end up in the exam. Anglo-Saxon. Who are these Anglo-Saxons? Well, you kind of know of them as some other words. You've probably heard the word Viking before. Okay? The word Viking is an early kind of use of this word Anglo-Saxon. Now, Britain, as a land piece of rock, is not very big. You can drive across it in a matter of hours, as a matter of fact. Okay? It's not a large place. Okay? The Romans invade that plot of land that they later will call Britannia, or Britain. And the Romans lived there on that plot of land right up until 410, when Rome falls. Now imagine this for a moment. You showed up at school this morning, and somebody said to you, you're talking with your pals, somebody said, dude, did you hear last night that all of the cops in Worland left town? They just left, right? And then your other friend says, no, dude, I heard all the cops in the state of Wyoming left. All the law enforcement. It just left last night. And then a third of your friends says, no, I heard all the law enforcement from the Mississippi River west left. And there ain't no cops from here to California. There ain't no cops from here to Texas. And there ain't no cops from here into Canada. None. Zero. Well, of course, I'll say it even though he's out of the room, a child would say, yes, no cops. Would you agree with me? Right? That is to say, yippee, there's no law enforcement. I'm not saying that there aren't a few things that wouldn't be fun to try, like taking your vehicle and driving it from the edge of town all the way to those railroad tracks next to the theater, and to just see if you could actually get all four wheels off the ground, when you hit that. I'm just saying that could be kind of fun. I'm not saying I recommend that you do this, but you could do it without worrying, right, that anybody's going to give you a ticket. You got me? But what would be the problem, right? A more mature mind would immediately recognize, dude, if all the law enforcement is gone out of our town, out of our state, out of our region, what immediately is the problem? You got it. So somebody shows up at your house with a 12 gauge and says everything you got now is what I got. You got no 911 to call. You got nobody to get help from. Think about it. What would immediately happen in our town, in our area, in our state, in our region? What would immediately happen if there was no law enforcement? Well, think about it in terms of security, though. What would immediately happen?
Murder?
I'm saying in terms of security, how you could keep yourself safe. What would immediately happen? Groups of people. Brilliant. Groups of people would start to form. Right away, this would happen. Groups of people, sometimes it would be families, sometimes it would be several families, sometimes it would just be groups of people. It would say, if you're in agreement with me, and then what would we do? We would form these groups out of security, correct? These groups, let's use a different word, tribes, right? These tribes would form. And right away, there would be rules within the tribe. There would probably be one leader. Let's call him a chieftain, right? One guy would come to the front and say, I'm going to make the rules. If you don't like the rules, then you can get out of our group. Of course, pretty quickly, what would happen? Well, groups would start vying for power over especially the resources. Water would be a big one, wouldn't it? Right? Whoever controls, for example, the Bighorn River would have a lot more power. Would you agree with me if we're just talking about our region, right? And then all of a sudden there would be fighting that would start to take place, right? When the Romans leave, this is what I want you to put in your notes. When the Romans leave in 410, all the cops go away. And immediately, groups form, right? These tribes. And you start to have these warring tribes. People fighting back and forth, okay? From outside of England, people from the north start arriving. These Northmen or Norsemen or Vikings arrive. They invade. They pillage. That means they take lots of stuff. And then they leave. Now, I cannot recommend the entire movie. But I can suggest to you at least one scene. And it's the opening scene of the very first Arnold Schwarzenegger film, Conan the Barbarian. Now, again, I cannot recommend this film, and he is a painfully bad actor. But Well, I will say this. When Schwarzenegger made that film, he had just finished winning his Mr. Universe final title, and he was a pretty remarkable physical specimen. When he makes this film, however, it's got nothing to do with Schwarzenegger. The film opens, and it shows you a little tiny village. Women working in the fields alongside men, children running in play. And then all of a sudden, the film breaks away to a group of guys on horseback. And they are B-A-D bad. They are huge men. They got these terrible masks on, and they are riding through the woods on horseback. They are just flying like bats out of Hades. And then they just arrive on this village. And they completely destroy the village. They kill all the people in it. They burn up all of the houses. They take away some of the children, of which, of course, one is the young Conan, right, as slaves. And then they just go away. And the last scene in this opening scene of this film is that village just on fire, getting torched. And then they just leave. Who are these people? Well, they are, again, Norsemen, Vikings. Now, we don't know a lot about these people. We know they were BAD. We know that for sure. Let me give you an example of how we know that. These people built ships and they sailed in what's called the North Atlantic, Icelandic Sea. Where right now today, if you fell in that water, you got about 20 seconds before you start freezing to death. That's how cold that water is. These people sailed ships in that water and they lived on the deck of the ship. They did not have any area below the deck of the ship. And that's where they stayed when they were on the boat. These Vikings were tough people. There was a sword found that weighed close to 50 pounds. And they assumed that it must be for some kind of ceremony until they found laying next to it a skeleton of close to 7 feet tall. Now, right now, I could take you in our weight room and have any one of you pick up 50-pound barbell. One or two of you could actually do it. But you ain't going to swing it around the way you would a sword. Can you imagine what fighting with a 50-pound sword must be like? Again, I'll say it one more time. These are amazing warring peoples. Something happened, though. Somewhere along the way, they stopped invading the villages and leaving, and they started just staying. That's what we call movement to an agrarian culture, agriculture. They started planting crops, and instead of going out and having to travel around to find their food, they raised their food. They became domesticated to some degree, agrarian. Over time, they stopped being this kind of warlike people, and they started instead telling stories about warlike people. And their number one hero was a cat named Beowulf, right? A story about a guy who fights against bad monsters. Okay? Actually, 3 of them. And we will in fact call those 3 parts of Beowulf, Beowulf 1, 2, and 3, contingent on the 3 monsters that Beowulf will fight. So when you pick up this poem to read it, and that's what it is a song about battle and fighting. Okay? So that's what we want to say in our notes. Now, the next thing we want to say is really important. And for this one, you're going to need your packet in front of you. So go ahead and take your packet real quickly that we've given to you. And I need you to look on page 1 of your packet. All right? Page 1 of your packet. The Beowulf epic is an example of what we will call early or old English. So you want to write this down. English is a language that we will call a hybrid language. What does that mean, Mr. Noel? Do you know what I mean when I say that? A hybrid language. That means what? Strands of different linguistic cultures do what? Come together or combine. Absolutely. Brilliant. So, for example, we will have Greek. We will have Latin. We will have some German. We will have some Scandinavian. And it will all come together in this remarkable thing called the English language. There are 3 steps to the development of this language. It makes sense. Old English, you want this in your notes. Middle English and Modern English. I'll say it again. Old English, Middle English, and Modern English. Our example of Old English is, are you ready for this? Beowulf. Beowulf. The epic poem. Our example of Middle English is Chaucer. That's this name I put here up on the board, roughly 1300. Our example of Modern English is Shakespeare. When you as a freshman read two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil hands make civil blood unclean. I'm quoting the opening lines of what play? R and J. You got it. When you read those words, you are actually reading the language of Shakespeare himself. That's exactly the words that he wrote. When, however, you look at Beowulf, well, we got a problem. Let me show you what that problem is. Go ahead now, sit up, look at page 1 of your packet, and I'm looking in the lower right corner. Do you see where it says, lines from Beowulf in Old English? Now we're going to ask Mr. Paulson to read that for us. And he's going to do his best attempt at it as he tries to read Beowulf. Are you ready? We're going to read it with him. This is Mr. Paulson reading in Old English. Your best reading voice, Mr. Paulson, as you are preparing, of course, to use that voice later. Go ahead.
Da come of more to go over or down.
See? Good guess, right? Good one, good one. Go ahead and go over. That's what we think anyway. It's a good question, though. Go ahead.
Da come of more under Misopum, Grendel Gogan, Gungan. Go to their bar. I don't know.
Let's give him a hand. I thought he did a good job. That's a pretty good attempt. Well done. Hey, let's point out, hello. Let's point out something really important. Are you ready for this? Mr. Paulson was reading English. Yes. This is English. But hello, for your notes, and you can write it right on your packet if you want to. You can circle it there. This is what we call Old English. There are very few people today alive who can read this stuff. But to be fair, there were 1 or 2 words, you could probably circle them in that reading, that you can kind of recognize. For example, if you know the poem Beowulf, you know that the first monster's name is Grendel, and there it is, right? So there are a few words that you can kind of pick up. But let's be fair, there ain't no way that we're going to get much meaning out of what Mr. Paulson was giving for us without some translation. So the first point I want to make is the Beowulf epic is an epic of Old English.
How come they
You
don't
cannot.
show middle?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
How come they don't show middle on it?
Well, Middle English we'll get to when we study the poetry of Chaucer. You can look on your course outline. I think we're 4 weeks out. When we hit Chaucer, I will make the observation. Now we are at Middle English. Got
Is it
me?
a lot easier to understand?
Middle English is going to be much easier to read, but we will still read Middle English in translation. It will only be when we hit Shakespeare, 1600 roughly, right? 600 years after Beowulf, we hit 1600 and Shakespeare. When we read Shakespeare, we're reading the very words that he wrote. Now, some students, freshmen, will say, it took me a while to be able to read Shakespeare and understand. As sophomores reading Julius Caesar, it's kind of rough, kind of iffy for me, right? But by the time we get to be seniors, when we're reading Macbeth and Hamlet later, you'll be able to get a pretty decent understanding of what's going on.
Okay.
What's going on. Now, in conclusion of this part of my lecture, I'm going to do what I rarely do. Mr. Hernandez, I don't do this very often. But I'm going to share with you a little bit of my own biography, my life. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about this poem, Beowulf. I was not raised in the United States for much of my life. I lived outside of it. And I went to schools that were what we would call private academies, okay? And I was, for a brief spell, as a freshman in high school, more than a year or two ago, I was in a private high school on a university campus. Our instructor in English, she was a pretty well-known instructor, and yet she got very excited when she told us that we were going to have a very special speaker come to present in our class. We were totally ready when he arrived. We had our spitwads ready to go, sorry, but we did. And oh man, when he walked in, he totally looked like what you would expect a professor of English to look like he hadn't been out in the sun for like 13 years, you know, that kind of thing. And he walked in, he had his little glasses on, his little bald head, his little tweed suit, and he walked in. He had this soft little voice as he introduced himself, and we were like, yes, we're going to have so much fun jacking on this guy. 9th grade boys, you can imagine. And he looked at us and he said, Today I'd like to introduce you to a famous poem called Beowulf. Of course, none of us had ever heard of Beowulf, nor did we care. And he said, I'd like to introduce you to the poem. And then he took his glasses off. Now, dude, it's more than a day or two since I was in 9th grade high school English, okay? Sorry, but it's true. And yet I can tell you that right now, I can call this memory up at a moment like it was just now happening. He takes these glasses off and he sets them down on the podium. He shuts his eyes and he starts rocking back and forth like this. Then he opens his mouth and the sound that comes out is nothing like the voice that he was speaking to us in. It's this low, deep, guttural sound. Have you ever heard people speak German, like when Mr. Tonkovich talks German? It's this sound that sounds like you got a hairball in the back of your throat kind of thing, right? That's that sound of German, isn't it? Real strong. And we could have sworn he was rapping. It had a beat like rap music that was really strong. And he was rocking back and forth with his eyes shut for a while. Of course, later, after I would become a teacher myself, I would realize he got us. And he did get us. All of those 9th grade boys looking at him like, is he like demon possessed or what is up with that? This is like something out of a bad movie. And then all of a sudden he opens his mouth and these words come out. Well, you know how you're just stupid when you're 9th grade. You just don't know. We were being presented the poem Beowulf. This cat was an old English scholar and had the poem memorized, okay? As he was reciting it for us. Right. As he was reciting it for us, I will say without insult to Mr. Paulson, he did a little bit better than Mr. Paulson. Mr. Paulson, he went on for quite some time, and it was this driving rhythm sound. It was poetry. And then he stopped for a second, and he opened his eyes and said, that's the Old English Beowulf poem. Let me talk to you about Old English. And of course, at that point, right, he totally had us, right? We were ready to listen to anything he had to say. The Beowulf poem is a poem that will take us now to the very earliest roots of English literature. But it's not the first epic poem. Let's make it in our notes a little list. You already know there's some poems that we call epic poems that predate 1000 Common Era. For example, what is the great two Greek epic poems? The stories of the fight at Troy and the journey of Odysseus back home. Collectively, we know it as the Troy Tale, the Iliad and the Odyssey. We should write those two titles down for ourselves. The Iliad and the Odyssey. Of course, these are attributed to a poet named what? Does anybody know? What's the name of the poet that is responsible? Say it out loud. Homer. Well done, Ralph Luther. Outstanding. Homer. Yeah, the great poet Homer is attributable for both the Iliad and the Odyssey. For those of you who've seen Brad Pitt's film Troy, we won't get into those other scenes. Troy, you know, that's the story, of course, of the battle at the walls of Ilium, of Troy, right? That's a famous epic poem of the Greek tradition. The famous epic poem of the Roman tradition is called the Aeneid, by a famous poet named Virgil. The Aeneid tells us the story of that large horse, wooden, empty horse, hollow, that was pushed inside the walls of Troy, and then those Greek soldiers came out, and then they killed all the people of Troy. You remember that? And Monty Python plays it as a large wooden badger and all that. Remember, a rabbit, right? Okay, same game. That's another epic poem, okay? So Beowulf is a poem in line with other epic poems. So we're going to have some things we can easily predict. 1, we're going to have a famous hero. His name is Beowulf. 2, this hero is going to fight against monsters. 3 of them. Grendel's mom.
And the dragon.
Some of you will say, dude, I was reading this plot summary and it sounded a lot like this film that's out right now.
What?
The Hobbit. What's up with the Hobbit? And the Hobbit has a story about a dragon as well. Well, the Hobbit was written by a cat named Tolkien, who is a famous Old English scholar who loved the poem Beowulf. So for those of you who are at all into Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, of course, you probably know it mostly by Pete Jackson's films, the trilogy of Lord of the Rings, and of course now The Hobbit, right? Tolkien, the author of those stories, was an Old English scholar. He loved Beowulf, and he translated Beowulf. So there's some carryover, if you will, okay? The epic will tell us a lot about these Anglo-Saxon people. Let's put it in your notes this way. It's what we will call the Anglo-Saxon Code. C-O-D-E, code. All right? In other words, if we want to know what matters to the Anglo-Saxon people, we'll go to this poem. And we're going to find out from this poem what they think of as important. By the way, I'll give you a hint. It has a lot to do with fighting and swords. Right? Swordplay. Of course, our culture is inheriting in large ways poems like this. Which is why, what does a marine commercial look like? Some fat slob that sits on the sofa and eats Doritos. No, I don't think so. What do those cats look like that are in a marine commercial? Well, they look like the boys you do not want to mess with. Notice in every marine commercial you've ever seen, always he's holding a sword. A sword? Are you kidding me? Dude, we have the finest fighting force on the planet, and that is without doubt. That we don't even debate that. And those guys, they go into some wicked bad places to fight. They don't take swords with them, right? They take some of the best technology that you can find anywhere on the planet. They don't walk in there with swords. What's up with swords in a marine commercial? The answer is the Beowulf epic. We're going to learn about swords. Are you ready for this? We're going to learn they even name their swords. They name their weapons. And their weapons are handed down from generation to generation. The way you define whether you're a man or not is how well you fight with your swords and your other weapons. They like to swing large hatchets and axes and things like that. They fight with those too. Finally, though, they like to be able to fight barehanded. And for the first time, we in the English language will hear the word that Mr. Hernandez knows well, grappling. Of course, we know what wrestlers do when they grapple. They are fighting what? Hand to hand, right? And we're going to, in fact, hear that very word grappling for the first time in the English language. We're going to hear it in this poem, okay? So we'll ask ourselves at the end of our time with this poem, what mattered to these people? And we're going to find out some really interesting things that matter. And we're going to be able to answer some really interesting questions that you haven't thought about. In every high school you go into, you will walk in, and somewhere, usually next to the gym, there are trophy cases. Trophy cases? So, for example, athletes get their picture taken and stuck on a piece of cardboard and then put behind glass. What's that all about? And it's a fair question to ask. How come that person gets chosen out of the entire girls' volleyball team, or the entire guys' soccer team, or the entire guys' football team, or the entire guys' wrestling program? How come that one person gets his or her picture taken? I mean, it's a fair question to ask. No matter what sport you're in, even if it's an individualized sport like track and wrestling, you're still part of a team. For example, where's the coach? Or, to be fair, coaches. Because anybody who's ever been in that trophy case, and I've taught a lot of those guys and gals, they all say the same thing. Couldn't have done it without all those coaches. Couldn't have done it without a number of adults out in the community. Couldn't have done it without all my teammates. Well, then how come you can choose one out of the entire team and let them get the picture? What's up with that? It's called Beowulf and the Beowulf epic. See how that works? And we'll have this conversation over and over again of the ways in which this Beowulf epic has influenced the way we think about our Western lives. Okay? And so this is really an important epic for us right from the beginning. So, welcome to Beowulf. We'll begin with the Beowulf epic tomorrow in detail. My hope is that you're able to say what you know the three monsters of Beowulf are in detail. So make sure you've read your